Welcome back to KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM, The Joe Miller Show. We're honored to have with us Richard Pearcey. He's the editor and publisher of the Pearcey Report and his blog, Pro-Existence. He is the former managing editor of the Capitol Hill newspaper, Human Events. I'm sure you've all heard of that. He's also the associate editor of the Evans-Novak Political Report. Born in Germany, educated in the U.S. He has a master's in divinity. I believe I might not be getting this right. Master's in divinity, yes, from Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis. Right. Also master's in philosophy from the Institute of Christian Studies in Toronto. Prolific writer, very much involved online. You've probably seen his writings, not just American Thinker, Daily Caller, CNS News, Examiner, WorldNet Daily, The Washington Times, of course, Human Events, where he used to manage Boundless, Citizen of the World. He's also edited a number of different books, and most recently, he has also been involved in some writings on the radical gay agenda and its impact on freedom in America. Mr. Pearcey, welcome to the Joe Miller Show.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's great to be with you.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about one of the topics that has been pretty much a weekly subject. Of course, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Indiana that passed out and then was compromised by follow-on legislation by Governor Pence. Several weeks ago, it's created kind of an uproar, kind of a backlash in conservative circles. There's a real increasing debate that is surrounding an issue that just 5 or 10 years ago, people wouldn't blink an eye about. And that's about making sure religious freedom is basically maintained for those that believe that they shouldn't have to be forced to do certain things in the marketplace. Those on the radical side of things, the gay agenda, are pushing back. And I wanted to just kind of get your views on this. I mean, you recently wrote a foreword to a book called Finding Truth, 5 Principles for Unmasking Atheism, Secularism, and Other God Substitutes. You talk a little bit about the end game of homosexual extremism. Maybe we could start a little bit on that overview and then go into the specifics as to how it's impacting freedom currently in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before the program, Joe, I checked the Drudge report, and right now there is a story that Drudge headlines, auto shop owner receiving death threats after announcing he won't serve gays. And it's a West Michigan business owner claiming he's been targeted of death threats. And he says our rights as conservative Americans are being squashed more and more every day. And I just mentioned that because in thinking about the homosexual agenda, which let me say, if I thought their arguments held water, I would have no hesitancy in agreeing with them and supporting them. But I agree with someone like Albert Camus. He talked about the revolt of intelligence, or the intelligence, and not allowing our passion to become blind. I'm concerned in that the push for what's called marriage equality is an example of allowing our quote-unquote passions to become blind. And when you see a Michigan shop owner receiving hundreds of emails and comments saying, hundreds of comments talking about death threats to his family and friends, burning his shop down, I would suggest that it may be that something else is going on here other than other than what might be implied by the pleasing slogan, marriage equality. So I would suggest a revolt of intelligence, and by that I mean free-thinking people, independent thinkers, have a right, as do shop owners, you and me, anybody who wants to think for themselves, a human being, has a right to not be shoved or herded like a bunch of cows in a certain direction by certain people in the culture. If I decide to go buy a car, and I go to the car shop or the dealership, and the guy says, well, the only reason you don't want to buy this car is because you're a racist, or you don't like the color of my skin, or you're too rich, and etc. Well, I kind of wonder, does this person really believe in his or her product? If you really believe and have confidence in what it is you're advocating, you can relax. You can say, look, here are the arguments. We invite you to think about them. We will give you space for your critical distance. We will respect you as someone who can think for him or herself. You do that, and you come back in 6 weeks, 6 months or a year, and we'll continue the dialogue. But I don't see that happening.
And instead,
yeah.
Instead, there's extreme bullying that goes on. I mean, it just shocked me in Indiana, for example. I mean, here's Indiana that is proposing a law which is virtually identical to 30 other states' laws on religious freedom. It's identical, effectively, to the federal act as well. And the incredible aggressive reaction that was seen from the gay lobby to that bill, again, identical to 30 states in the federal act, it was absolutely shocking. And you see also in the same way this degree of aggressive bullying that goes on with respect to businesses. I mean, you heard, of course, about the pizzeria that refused apparently the setup call as to whether or not they would serve a gay wedding pizzas, and just the anger and the type of reaction nationally toward the pizzeria. Now, of course, on the other hand, there are a lot of good, solid folk that got behind him. There was a crowdfunding effort, and several $100,000 were raised for the business. So there was a reaction as well. But it is extraordinary how the media carries this bullying message. And it's one that I've observed for some time. It's really, when you look at society and you look at attitudes toward gay marriage and you see how this has progressed, I mean, this is a top-down effort to impose conformity on the people of this country on this issue.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that analysis. If you look at the phrase marriage equality, it sounds positive, but just like in grammar, two negatives equal a positive, it may be that in public relations, two positive equal a negative. Now, for example, the equality that is talked about with marriage equality, I think, is actually a code word for a deeper philosophic movement that often does not lead to peace and harmony, and that movement is relativism. That equality is not the kind of solid, rock-solid equality that we have, for example, in the Declaration of Independence, which realizes that human equality is an endowment from the Creator and not from Washington, D.C. or any kind of other human institution. And there's a world of difference, you might even say a civilization of difference, between the relativistic equality and the fantastic liberation that comes from being created equal. And this kind of takes us to the book that Finding Truth, that I wrote a foreword for. Finding Truth, the theme of Finding Truth is 5 principles that unmask atheism, secularism, and other God substitutes. And the point is, there's a mantra out there in the culture that we see expressed in the push for homosexual rights, homosexual marriage, people shouting racism at the drop of a hat. And that mantra is, don't think, just believe. You can see it, unfortunately, in churches sometimes with an unfortunate concept of faith. You can see it all over the place in the classroom, the campus, the voting booth, the workplace, the corporate boardroom. And this book, which happens to be written by Nancy Pearcey, who is a very close friend of mine, she happens to be a best-selling writer and so forth. She is a former agnostic. She herself, when she was a teenager, she was raised in a Christian family and so forth. She herself started asking questions. To me, to be a human being, Joe, to me to be a human being is to learn, is to ask questions. Whether you're at a new job, going on a vacation, you got a flat tire on the side of the road. Human beings, it's human to ask questions and to learn. Well, when it comes to the big questions of life, of course you're going to ask questions. And what she found was that the people in her life responded to her questions negatively, and so she just consciously, after a while, she decided, Christianity must not have any kind of intellectual foundation. And so she quite explicitly in high school dropped Christianity as so much nonsense and embarked on her own search for truth. And what I've done in the foreword is I've tried to show that if you understand the Judeo-Christian worldview as it's written, it's very much a book that's pro-free thinking. Let me define pro-free thinking. I define free thinking.
Rick, we're going to have to hold on that because we've got to go to break, but hold that thought. We'll chat more about that. We're with Rick Pearcey, editor and publisher of the Pearcey Report, former managing editor of Human Events. Well-published, well-thought author, writer. More with him in the Joe Miller Show after these messages. Please stay with us. Welcome back to KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM, the Joe Miller Show. We're honored to have with us Richard Pearcey. He's the editor and publisher of the Pearcey Report and his blog, Pro-Existence. He's the former managing editor of the Capitol Hill newspaper, Human Events, associate editor of the Evans-Novak Political Report. He studied the Labrie Fellowship, also educated Masters in Divinity, Masters in Philosophies. He also, I didn't mention this last segment, has edited a number of best-selling books, and that includes Persecution, How Liberals Are Waging War Against Christianity. That's a book by David Limbaugh. Total Truth, Liberating Christianity from Its Cultural Captivity by Nancy Pearcey. And I chuckled last segment when he mentioned Nancy. That's not just his friend, but his wife as well. And also has some other books that he's worked on editing. Storycraft, Reflections on Faith, Culture, and Writing from the author of Hank the Cowdog. In any event, we were talking, Rick, about your wife's book. And while we're talking about this, people want to get a copy of that book. I guess the best place to go is Amazon.com. And the title of the book that you were discussing is Finding Truth.
Yes, Finding Truth, 5 Principles for Unmasking Atheism, Secularism, and Other God Substitutes. And
you were talking last break about your wife's kind of search for truth. I guess we can pick up there.
Yeah, and what I wanted to do is transition to the forward, which I wanted to show I can make a case on the basis of biblical data that the Judeo-Christian worldview is a free thinker's paradise. What do I mean by that? Consider what famed atheist Richard Dawkins said. He has this quote, "Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence, the belief, in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence." Well, what I can show is that if you go through the biblical data, what is given there is just a tremendous emphasis on testing everything. You can go to the information in the Old Testament. You can go to the information in the New Testament, and I lay out in the forward from there's a passage in 1 Thessalonians 5:21 where Paul, who was an intellectual, he actually challenges the people of his day, test everything. He does that specifically in regard to something quote unquote spiritual, but that's very interesting because we have this culture which says you're not supposed to talk about religion and politics. Well, in a Judeo-Christian worldview, you get to test everything, the so-called spiritual, the so-called everyday realities, etc. So I make the case that in a Judeo-Christian worldview, the emphasis is extremely strong on a high view of reason, a high view of the individual to search things out for him or herself, and to follow the evidence wherever it might lead. As a matter of fact, from the words of Christ himself and how he handled the skeptical disciple Thomas, you can say that Christianity is not religious in the way modern people think of religion. Modern people think of religious in the way of it's something you believe and you hope it's true and you go hide in your closet and try to stay away from facts. That's kind of the Richard Dawkins take. The Judeo-Christian worldview is, no, if it's not true, you don't have to embrace it, period. If it is true, maybe you need to do some thinking about how you orient your life. It's much more, I think there's a misconception out there. That's why I say, and I show in the forward through many, many examples, that the Judeo-Christian worldview is very strong in appealing to people to think things through for themselves. And this actually takes us back to Labrie, where my wife and I actually met. Because that was a place where people engaged you as a whole person, not as some kind of spirit, not some kind of person who wasn't interested in ideas, but as a whole person. And this kind of takes us back to the whole homosexual marriage debate and the whole, racism on all the isms jumping all over America these days. I think that the attempt to stampede people and to threaten people, etc. And on behalf of a particular ideology or a particular politics or policy. And I don't care whether it's Republicans really don't do it because they don't really stand for too much these days, but whether we're Republicans or so-called middle of the road, obviously the Democrats, that's their modus operandi. That approach is extremely disrespectful of the human being. It's extremely disrespectful of the faculty of reason that we have been endowed with by our Creator, and that's why I agree with atheist Albert Camus, and I call for a revolt of intelligence against this kind of disrespect for the human being, especially in regard to our rightful need to have a critical space and critical distance and think things through and not be herded around like a bunch of cows by people who happen, at this point in time, by people who happen to have a big megaphone. So to me, that's a kind of a way of tying together some of our discussion about homosexualist extremism and addressing what is a misconception about the utterly liberating high view of reason and human thought and thinking things through that is set forth in the Judeo-Christian worldview.
And you certainly see that, of course, in the bullying that we talked about last segment. It is just almost a mindless approach. It's one that just completely rejects even past experience. But the real danger of this is it's based upon relativism. There's no real foundation of moral that undergirds that viewpoint. And how does that put society at risk, in your view, in the long term?
Well, let's think about relativism. What's the real world impact of this quote-unquote phrase, marriage equality, which is actually a symbol. It's actually an empty symbol being filled with the content of relativism. Here's what we need to know. The real-world endgame of so-called marriage equality is not to make marriage equally available to all, but to make marriage equally unavailable to all. I'll repeat that. The endgame is not to make marriage equally available to all, but to make marriage equally unavailable. And I can prove it from the mouth of marriage equality proponents themselves. For example, there's a woman I respect. She's a Russian American named Masha Gessen. She's a female homosexual. She's a journalist who writes for the New York Times. I respect anyone who is willing to write critically and put themselves in danger vis-a-vis the Russian experience. She spoke openly about the endgame of the homosexualist agitation when she was at a conference in Sydney, Australia. It was the Sydney Writers' Festival. Here's what she said during a panel discussion. She said, "It's a no-brainer that we should have the right to marriage." And she said, "I also think equally, it's a no-brainer that the institution of marriage should not exist." That's a no-brainer. The institution of marriage should not exist. Now, see, this is what relativism is. Relativism says there are no objective structures to reality. There's no objective structure to what's right and wrong. There are no norms for what is right or wrong. There are no norms for things like marriage. It's pretty much we human beings are pretty much left to ourselves. Now, if you want to take that route, then you have to play that out to the end. If really human beings are left to themselves, well, why are homosexuals so upset that there's a Michigan auto shop owner in his world coming up with his own finite ideas of what he ought to do? Why are they trying to impose their relativism upon his relativism? I mean, what's the problem? Why should there be an uproar? So there's something else going on here. And the human being was actually, there is a structure to marriage. There is a structure to reality. Human beings who are part of that and part of who we are requires that we apply what we think is true to the real world. And once you say you think something is true, despite what you say about relativism, relativism. Once you say you think something is true, which is what happens every time somebody gets out there and parades and says, implicitly for marriage equality, they're actually saying that's an absolute truth, even though they don't have the basis for it. They're saying you should obey what this says. Unfortunately, they don't have the basis for it. And that's why I say we have to think about it. I call for the revolt of intelligence over against that kind of pushing and hurting.
Well, Rick, I appreciate your insights on that. I think you're straight on. One of the things that a lot of people don't think about is when we're talking about marriage, and you basically say that marriage can be anything, you take away the definition, marriage becomes nothing. End result of all of this, of course, is not good for the society, something that's not based upon absolutes, and the end result of that, of course, is a threat to freedom. Appreciate your insights on this. Would love to hear from your wife in the future as well regarding her book. We'll make sure that we stay in contact and invite you back.
Terrific, Joe. Terrific, Joe. Thank you very much. Let's get together again.
Stay with us. We've got another great guest coming up after these messages. The Joe Miller Show.